Hey everybody, what's up? My name is Mr. Vogel. I'm going to lead us in this third segment of our Ancient India unit. And before I get into the lecture, I have been requested to give a pun. Or a joke. I want to use a pun. So I know that online learning is challenging for you guys, and we're going into the fourth week now of it. So just hang on and curry on. Okay, if you didn't get that, you can go back and rewatch it. But for today, let's go ahead and get into our objectives here. We are going to be examining the major empires in ancient India. You've talked about a few of the previous civilizations, the Harappans and the Aryans, right? We're going to be looking at some different empires regarding the Mauryan Empire, the Gupta Empire, and the Kushan Empire. We're going to talk about regional governments that dominated India. You'll kind of see that there's actually less emphasis on politics in India compared to other early civilizations like China. We'll talk about the caste system, how its structure in India really was a foundational, not only social structure, but political structure and religious structure. And so the historical thinking skill that we're going to be looking at mainly today will be patterns of continuity and change over time. So here you're just making connections between patterns you see regarding change and things that are continuous, right? Things that are the same over long periods of time. So when you're reading, look for these themes. Look for these themes. What are things that are changing, right? What are things that are staying the same? And then when you notice those things that are staying the same, how do you assess that? How do you evaluate its positives and negative effects on that country, right, or that empire over time? So that's what this historical thinking skill is referencing, and you'll be applying these more and more throughout the semester as we get into some of our summative projects later on. For your homework, make sure you finish your Krishna and Arjuna questions. If you have, we won't be working on these in class. Obviously, you'll be working on them at home. And then also make sure you have finished up your section 3 notes, okay, and have those submitted. Now, when we're looking at the patterns of classical India, something we're going to discuss is how political and cultural patterns changed and developed over time. So we're going to start in 330 BC with the Mauryan Empire, and we're going to end in around 500 AD with the Gupta Empire, and then I'll briefly kind of mention the collapse of the Gupta Empire and the rise of the Huns. And so also when you're studying this time period in history, a pattern that you'll notice is there's conquerors not just moving from west to east, but you also see conquerors moving from north to south and east to west. So there's just a lot of movement in regards to trade, in regards to religion, and other influences, right, of social structures and politics, and currencies and weights and measures and technology and all of these types of things traveling along what we know as the Silk Roads, which we'll look at later on this year. Now, the first segment we have here is the Mauryan Empire, so 324 to 184 BC. And before this period, India is full of many different small kingdoms, right, that are competing for various different resources in various different regions of land. So it's just a lot of chaos. You've got 16 powerful kingdoms all competing for these things. And there's a brief period where actually Alexander the Great comes into play, okay? And from 327 to 325 BC, they start to move into northern India and the Indus Valley region. And this is seen by Chandragupta, and he starts to study about this guy, Alexander the Great, wants to step into this role of uniting the subcontinent of India. And so he looks at Alexander the Great and sees, hey, this guy is all about uniting a national empire, all about having a strong military, all about establishing religious and cultural tolerance and efficient trade, and et cetera, et cetera. Hey, I want to do the same thing. And so this really paves the way for one of the greatest empires to ever occur in Asia. And so something about the Mauryans is their military tactics were quite impressive. They had a very large military. Some say about 700,000 soldiers. They used these mobile giants, as you can see pictured here, elephants charging into battle. Another major victory for Chandragupta under the Mauryan dynasty would be against Seleucus. Seleucus was a previous general of Alexander the Great, who was one of his largest successors. He saw the Indus Valley being challenged by the Mauryan Empire and would go to war with the Mauryans from about 305 to 303 BC, and eventually would win. The Mauryan Empire would win that war. Not only did they gain back the Indus Valley, but they also gained a large chunk of Afghanistan through trade agreements with Seleucus. Something you see within the social structure and culture is that under Chandragupta versus Ashoka, who will come later, you see that Hinduism is still really the central preservation of India's social order, their social system, their culture, and also their political system. So Ashoka is going to be the next major king of this empire that was very significant during its reign, and he was actually the third ruler, right? But he was autocratic. Also came from Buddhist or Hindu background, like his grandfather, and was very militant-minded. Okay, so he was somewhat bloodthirsty, and this would change after the Battle of Kalinga. Okay, so we'd have success at the Battle of Kalinga, where he went in to take over this region in the southeastern part of the peninsula, controlled by the kingdom of Kalinga. But due to his success, he would also have great sacrifice with that. About 100,000 men died of his own at that battle. This really grieved him, and he really began to see issue of control and his issue of wanting to expand vastly at the cost of anything. And so this is when he changed. He dedicated and vowed to take on a more peaceful way of life that would not inflict pain on his own people. And he pledged to be a more peaceful and considerate and loving leader to his people. And so therefore he took on this philosophy of Buddhism. And as he converts to Buddhism, he also makes a moral code across the entire subcontinent of India from the Mauryan Empire, and that would be the moral code of Dharma, right? Dharma is the law of moral respect to all living things to sustain and promote peace. So this includes animals, not only humans. So this is when you see animal sacrifices are now illegal and banned throughout every religion, and he makes this moral code not just across Buddhists, right, but across all religions. So while there's still religious tolerance in India, he does restrict people to animal sacrifices and says that the moral code must be followed in your religion. And it even affected like hunters and gatherers, as they were expected to be held to this as well. So during his reign of the Mauryan Empire, you see dissemination through the edicts of Ashoka, right? So Buddhism is dispersed, it's spread by these edicts, and these edicts are put on various different things like large stones. They're written in caves, they're written on pillars, as you see pictured here in the right, and also on things called stupas. Okay, and this stupa in particular is one of the most well preserved stupas during the time of Ashoka at Sarnath, and he would disseminate these edicts all throughout India and even other regions of Asia, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even in parts of China. And so after the death of Ashoka, the empire really begins to fall apart. Within 50 years, the edicts are forgotten, the name of Ashoka is forgotten, and you see a decline of Buddhism. Even though the Kushans still push it later on, this is when Buddhism begins to have less significance in India. So if we were to look at a map here of the Mauryan Empire, this is what it would look like, pictured here on the left at its height, okay, about 3 million square miles of land. And then on the left here, you can see pictured is the subcontinent before the Battle of Kalinga. So this little area right here is where Kalinga was, the kingdom of Kalinga. And so that's where Ashoka would really change his philosophy on ruling. Okay, who knows? Like if that battle had gone differently, who knows how big India would have become. But they never actually captured this southern tip here. And there's various reasons for that. The northern territories were under heavy attack from the west, raiders. And so they needed to have military in the north. And so they bringing their military all the way from the north down to the south could have made them vulnerable to attacks in the north. It's also very difficult to move your troops all the way from here to here and then back up to here, right, in case you are invaded. So things like that. Also, the south is known for its hot climate and its difficult terrain. It's very hilly there, and it's also narrow, right? It's much more narrow here than it is, say, up here. So there's just a lot of different things that should be taken into consideration in regards to this specific area and why they couldn't capture it. So the next empire we have here would be the Kushan Empire from about 152 to 220 AD. The Kushans actually were an Indo-Euro nomadic group, so there are about 5 Indo-Euro nomadic groups, and so they came from the Yuezhi Confederation. But the greatest ruler during the Kushan Empire would have been King Kanishka, and he was well known for charging and leading his armies into central India, taking that region here. Okay, and also going west to westward China and establishing that region as well. In terms of what the Kushan Empire is most known for, it would be for their strong economic trade system, right? They were a very diverse economy. They were the trade capital of the world during the Silk Road period. So they were a major segment in regards to the Silk Road as the Greeks, the Romans, and the Chinese all met here to trade various different products. And then also they facilitated the spread of Buddhism. So some, however, would say that while they might have facilitated the spread of Buddhism, they also weakened its spread throughout India. But Buddhist monasteries were more open to the public for worship during the Kushan Empire. And I also would say that traders who were traveling to this trade capital of the world, right, would have been probably influenced by this new Eastern philosophy of Buddhism and Hinduism as well, which they would have taken back to their countries. So the last empire we're going to talk about here would be the Gupta Empire from 320 to 535 AD. So the Guptas were the largest political entity in South Asia from the early 4th century to about the mid 6th century. And Chandragupta would be the first leader of this empire, not related to Chandragupta of the previous empire we talked about in regards to the Mauryans. Okay, different Chandragupta. It's just a common name, I guess. But this would be really the establishment of a Hindu empire again. Okay, and this is known as the Golden Age of India. So if you ever hear the Golden Age, it's referencing the Gupta Empire. And the reason they call it that is because you just see this mass commercial and cultural exchange happening. And you see a lot of advancements in like science, medical research, technology, the development of universities for the first time. So it's kind of similar to what you see in the Roman Empire in the West. But there's this reestablishment of Hinduism and influence from the Brahmic Vedic religions. You see India's social stability is now more peaceful rather than what you maybe saw more so in the Vedic ages, as there are intermarriages happening. People are becoming vegetarians. Buddhism is more mystical in a sense rather than so sacrificial with these rituals and whatnot. So it's more of an experience, right? As we see switching from the Vedas, right, to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. But lastly here, does Buddhism still have a sense of significance in India? The answer is yes. And you see this even in architectural structures like the Ajanta and Ellora caves, right? Buddhism and Hinduism are very peaceful towards each other. And that's one thing we see very clearly in terms of a pattern in India, is that India is very religiously tolerant, right? They're not rigid by any means in terms of religious beliefs. They're very fluid in a sense. So the last slide we're going to talk about here in regards to the empires would be the fall of the Gupta dynasty, and that would happen around 550 CE, when India starts to fall into, they begin to crumble, I guess I'll just say. The White Huns move in around 451 AD. So at this point in time, India is in a big power struggle between all those various regions, kind of as we talked about like during the Mauryan dynasty. You had 16 powerful regions. Same kind of thing here, right? An empire rises and then it falls, and then it's a bunch of regions competing for the land, and then an empire rises and then it falls, and then a bunch of regions are competing for the land. Same thing is happening over and over here. But the White Huns come in, and the White Huns were a horde from the Hunnic tribe of Central Asia, okay, from the Empire of the Hunna, and in this area right here. And they're going to then move into northern India. One thing about the White Huns is that they were very militant minded, so it's kind of interesting. You saw that militant mindset kind of move out of India. Now here it's coming back in. But also after this empire, after the Huns empire fell within India, they became so integrated with the Indian culture that you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference between their practices and traditions, between their practices and traditions compared to the Indian culture. And so when you look at this historical thinking skill that I mentioned earlier, changes and continuity over time, what are some things that are continuous? Well, one thing that was very continuous was the area of India that the Turkish nomads crossed to invade, and that was the Khyber Pass. Okay, the Khyber Pass was a narrow passage that was long used for trade routes and also for military invasions. Okay, so trade routes, especially during the Kushan Empire and the Gupta dynasty, it was very crucial to reach the west and the east. But it was also important for military invasions. It was used by Alexander the Great to invade northern India, and eventually later on it would be used by Genghis Khan. So you could assess some of the positives and negatives of the Khyber Pass and its influence on India. So there is a historical thinking skill and an example. The significance, okay, of the White Huns' influence on India would be one, just trade transformation. Okay, India had great trade relations with the Roman Empire prior to the White Huns coming in, and now it's really disrupted. However, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because then they were able to trade more so with the East and starting to trade more with China and in other areas of that region of the world where they prospered vastly. India was a very wealthy country. And then the other one would be racial admixture in India. So lastly, we're going to just recap what we've talked about in regards to all these empires, looking at political institutions. The main point that you need to understand is, what type of political institution did India have? And the answer is regionalism, right? India did not have a solid political institution like all of these other empires that we see in history. When you look at the Greeks, when you look at the Romans, when you look at the Chinese, right? Regionalism uses regional control rather than centralized control. So they didn't really have a main political feature. They didn't really have a centralized government. They didn't have a strong foundation, in the sense that they didn't really know who was in control in all of these different regions of the empire, because they allowed others to lead. Except maybe more so under the Mauryan Empire, there was a lot more centralized control. But for the most part, ever since the Aryans, man, at the very beginning, they did not enforce a centralized government, and so that really just was never established. And even in terms of their own language, right? There's over 1,000 languages spoken in India today. So that just goes to show you there's not a lot of centralized government there. Yes, Sanskrit was the language of India during these empires. However, only the educated could speak it, right? Only the priests and the intellectuals were able to use it. So political administration was less necessary in India, okay? The caste system remained really the only solid structure within their political system, within their religious system, within their social structure, okay? It all came back to the caste system, and it really organized the way of life. So every aspect of life beyond imperial control was linked and pegged to this caste system. In recap, looking at the historical patterns in India, we talked about economics, we talked about trade becoming really a constant part of the Silk Road, as you saw, the Khyber Pass being a very influential place that allowed that trade to go from east to west. And then within the Indian subcontinent, politics, we just talked about how India was not a centralized government, but instead it was a regionalist, had a regionalist mindset, or a regionalist system with kingdoms. And then the culture in of itself was based off of the caste system, right? It really remained the only solid structure that people continued to live by. It gave rules of life on how people marry, how people, what jobs you can have, who you can eat with, where you live. Although India did not have a single governing entity like China and some of these other empires, it was a very distinct culture, and it was based on fluidity and had so much contact with different societies, and it flourished, man. India flourished. It's why we know it as one of the greatest ancient civilizations. All right, that's it for today, guys. Go ahead and answer these questions in the comment bank on PowerSchool. Why do you think modern day India has such a difficult time eliminating the caste system today? And in the end, what single factor allowed Hinduism to flourish and Buddhism to decline? I want you to focus, I want you to think about these things. We've talked about the patterns of India, and I want you to answer these questions to the best of your ability, okay? We'll see you guys next time.